a large intention for this conference is to invite and encourage voices from all sectors of the publishing industry and landscape and from all different levels of experience. So in addition to hearing student work, our next presenters are going to represent some perspectives and some voices and experiences from scientific and medical publishing. Before we get started, we still have a few minutes, but I do want to formally welcome and introduce our next panel, which begins at 12:30, entitled Ethics in Scientific Publishing. We're going to hear from Dr. Leonard Jack of the Center for Disease Control, better known as the CDC, as well as from a few folks at the Society for Microbiology, including Aashi Chaturvedi. We're going to address different issues concerning ethics, working with authors, and different approaches to diversity, equity, inclusion, and reducing health disparities and working specifically in scientific publishing. So again, just an opportunity to welcome voices from a lot of different spaces in the publishing landscape that all concern ways that we can produce content more ethically, that we can work together more ethically, and that we can uncover issues, as we just learned in our last session, where there's still work to be done. For those of you joining us online, welcome again. Please do notice that there's a button on your interface that says Interact. That Interact button will allow you to submit comments or questions that John and I will intercept and share with the panelists. Please note if you would like to be, your comment would like to be shared anonymously, or if you prefer that we include your name, we can do either. We're happy to honor requests. But again, that's the best opportunity for you to add comments, add questions, anything for our panelists as the conference moves on. So with that, I'm happy to welcome our next speakers. I don't know if we have them here in our virtual room. It looks like we do. Dr. Leonard Jack of the CDC and Aashi Chaturvedi. You're welcome to unmute, turn on your cameras in whichever order you're going in first. Hi, good morning, Aashi. I'll let you guys take it away.
Hi, my name is Aashi Chaturvedi, and I am the Senior Ethics Specialist at American Society for Microbiology. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for your presence here today. My name is Aashi Chaturvedi. I'm Senior Ethics Specialist at American Society for Microbiology, and I joined the Department of Ethics and IDEA at American Society for Microbiology just about a little over a year ago. So I'm incredibly thankful to the organizers here for these 2 days packed with a lot of information and learning for beginners in publishing ethics like myself. And I'm especially grateful to Pooja and John for giving me the opportunity to present this talk today. In this talk, I will share our experience with a pilot program we did earlier this year to detect instances of duplication, image duplication to be precise, in our accepted manuscripts, and what it taught us as publishers about our workflow and our immense value behind educating the authors and the scientific community in general about maintaining image integrity in scholarly publishing. So as a scholarly publisher, ASM has a wide variety of journalists across all areas of microbiology, from basic science to applied sciences to clinical to environmental. We have a wide variety of open access journals, from highly selective to broad community-based to sound science journals. We also have review titles. There are 15 journal titles under ASM journals, and these handle about 19,530 submissions and 5,873 publications in 2022. So with this high volume that we undertake, ASM deeply values its responsibilities to publish high quality, accurate, and representative data. And publishing images or data without any integrity issues is a key component of our mission to publish sound science. This means that we are constantly ensuring that as an STM publisher, the data presented to our readers is robust and reliable. It is reproducible by anyone using the same set of materials and methods. And the findings are consistent and can be replicated through independent experiments and approaches. And although these are referred to as hallmarks of sound science, we are always mindful of the exceptions in the field of biology and the different systems that are around us. But maintaining sound science is a big ask. These are questions that are answered either during the peer review process when the manuscripts are being screened by our reviewers and editors, but they're also scrutinized by scientists everywhere post-publication. That said, there is the aspect of how reliable is the data and how do we ensure it pre-publication. And that is determined when each image presented in the data is screened for obvious red flags. And how do we do this? How do we maintain image integrity in scholarly publishing? At ASM, all accepted manuscripts are routinely pre-screened to ensure that all images therein are free of any integrity issues. And we do this with the help of ASM's image specialist, who utilizes the tools from Adobe Photoshop and Office of Research Integrity for screening all the accepted manuscripts. Some common issues that we see during image screening are mentioned here. Unacknowledged splicing, wherein the gels and blots can be cut but are not disclosed to the authors. Image stitching, where several images are put together or mosaics are generated, but this is not transparently disclosed to the authors. And then there are images with figure concerns where portions of images are treated differently than other portions. Some intentions behind it could be to make the image look pretty and perfect for publication. We can also additionally do forensic screening at ASM. So when we are alerted to issues in published articles where the concerned readers or on platforms like PubPeer bring up issues in our published articles, for example, as shown below, suspected image duplications or inappropriate image duplications in the figure presented below, we can analyze these using forensic tools like Adobe Difference Function in Photoshop or tools from ORI. However, up until recently, we did not have efficient tools to proactively screen for image duplication instances pre-publication. In 2016, in an article in MBio, it was determined that about 4% of the 20,000 research articles that were screened, they had at least one figure that contained an inappropriate duplication. When one considers this high volume of manuscripts that ASM handles, this 4% of figure is also large enough to account for addressing these concerns pre-publication, then having to correct the scientific record later. So when ImageTwin launched in 2022, we wanted to determine if this is a possible tool that we can utilize for this purpose. So we began the pilot study in January 2023 with a single journal title. And before I proceed further, I want to acknowledge that although we do consider that ImageTwin has been a useful tool for us, as an independent organization, ASM does not endorse the software itself. We are merely sharing our experience with the software and what we learned about image duplication issues during this pilot program. So let me talk a little bit about ImageTwin. As I said, it was launched in 2022, and it utilizes AI-based algorithms to detect image integrity issues in the figures within scientific articles. It's particularly efficient at detecting image duplication issues in several figure types, including gels and blots, microscopy images, fluorescent or bright field, and light photography images. Yes, there are limitations that certain types of figures and data cannot be accurately screened at this time. And there are also the significant number of false positives that need to be ruled out, but it can still screen a majority of the figures types that ASM publishes. ImageTwin can screen figures within a manuscript and across articles. Of course, these are open access articles. And although the pilot started with a single journal title, what I'm going to present here today is data from March through August, when ASM expanded its pilot program to include all journal titles. So the process itself involves 3 stages of scanning, reviewing, and reporting. All accepted manuscripts are scanned by our image specialist using ImageTwin. To rule out any false positive, the image specialist visually confirms all potential duplicates identified by ImageTwin. And these are further verified using the Adobe difference function to confirm likely duplication. Only the potential duplicates that have been scanned and reviewed through these verification steps are included in the official report that is generated to be shared further. To elaborate this further, I have an example right here, which shows an ImageTwin report with the manuscript number, the figures affected, and the panels and which ones are similar, and how are the images duplicated. It could also be a figure as shown here with like multiple panels where the images are identified. We then use Adobe difference function. So the images are placed on a separate layer and then overlaid on top of each other, as can be seen here. And then if the resulting image is completely black, it confirms the likely duplication. Once the figures are screened and the figure concerns report is ready, it is shared with the ASM Journal's ethics team, of which I'm a member, along with Alicia Hibbert, and the team is led by Amy Coolis, the Director of Ethics and Idea Department at ASM. We review the concerns within these reports and send an initial inquiry to the corresponding author requesting verification, clarification, original underlying data, any images that they can share to resolve these concerns as may be applicable. We review the response from the authors. And if the response is satisfactory, the revised images or the text modifications are incorporated and the manuscript is continued with the production. However, if the concerns are not resolved, we consult with the editors-in-chief, handling editor, the journal staff members, and continue to follow up with the authors until the concerns are resolved. With this process in place, we began to realize that ImageTwin is a useful tool, and the pilot was successful in identifying image duplication concerns pre-publication so that we can address them. The pie chart reflects the data from March 1st to August 31st for all ASM journals. During this time, we accepted 3,298 manuscripts, and we detected through ImageTwin image duplication concerns in about 134 manuscripts. Please note here that the actual duplication events themselves could be much higher because a single manuscript can have multiple duplication instances. Therefore, we were identifying approximately 4% of our accepted manuscripts had image duplication concerns. Of these, over 90% of the cases were within the same manuscript. Image duplication issues were limited to the same manuscript. But we also detected in 7% of the cases image similarities between a previously published article and the manuscript that we accepted. If we compare the numbers to other image integrity concerns that that the ethics team addressed during this time, like unacknowledged splicing or non-uniform image enhancements, it was striking to see that over 50% of image integrity concerns were those of image duplication. So why was it so? What did we hear from the authors in their response? Well, the most common response was it was an honest mistake. It was a copy-paste error. We were assembling multiple panels. It was a large figure. We forgot to remove placeholder images. Oh, the file names were too similar, so we just pasted the wrong one. The mistake happened because we did not update the final version of the manuscript and so forth. Some mistakes were, some errors were intentional in the sense that the authors conducted a large experiment and they split up data. So the control set of experiments and the images thereof were similar. And sometimes the authors were also unaware that they needed to declare an image reuse, even if the data is theirs. So the good news is that for most of the concerns, these resolutions were relatively straightforward. So in some cases, like the ones shown here, where the use was intentional, such as reusing controlled data sets in different figures to present data more clearly and effectively, or when the images from the data are reused in a schematic to make a point, we requested the authors to be transparent about this image reuse and acknowledge it in the legend. For other concerns where the image was incorporated by mistake, like the one shown here, while assembling the figure, the same image was copy-pasted twice, we requested the authors to replace the image with the correct representative image, and the figure was revised and manuscript moved forward. In situations where the image reuse was because of from a previously published article, we required our authors to follow ASM publishing ethics policy, where it is incumbent upon the corresponding author to identify and acknowledge the source of the image in the submission form, obtain the permission from the original copyright holder, and transparently acknowledge the duplication in the figure legend and cite the original article. The pie chart here shows that in instances where image duplications were from previously published articles, and there were 9 such articles, about 20% of the time they were addressed by attributions in the legend with necessary permission. Mostly, like in 7 instances here, the authors chose to revise the figures with other images from the experiment. The tough part, sometimes resolutions can be very complicated. And let me put this into perspective here, using this bar graph. A large majority of the authors either chose to or were guided by us to provide revised figures by replacing the incorrect or inappropriate duplicate image in their manuscripts. Then there were several instances where in the manuscripts, we requested the authors to attribute image reuse in the figure legend and modify materials and methods accordingly. And sometimes the resolutions required both image and text modifications. But then there were 9% of cases that wherein the ethics team reached out to the editors-in-chief, handling editors and journal staff for consultation regarding next steps. And I will elaborate on some such instances here. So as exemplified by the image on the right, editorial counsel was sought in cases where there were too many image duplications. And it involves additional image integrity issues as well. For example, rotating images, resizing, flipping, or adjusting other parameters like brightness and contrast within the image. All of these colored boxes presented in the image are color-coded instances of image duplication within the one figure in a manuscript. As you can see, the boxes are different shapes, sizes, and orientations. This can become even more serious if the authors are unable to provide a relevant justification or original underlying data for these images. The reasons were plenty. They couldn't contact the collaborator who generated this image, or there were inappropriate file names, so they cannot figure out which image is which. In either case, these were serious instances that needed further consultation with the editorial team. In certain cases, as the one shown here, the authors resolved the original duplication concerns, which are shown here with red and blue boxes on the top panel. But with the revised figure, there appeared new duplication concerns, like the ones shown in the red boxes in the lower panel. So sometimes the authors suggested repeating experiments, as was the case in this instance where the authors then requested they repeat the entirely internally controlled experiments. Or in other situations, they wanted to delete the problematic panels of the figure, which in itself is an ethical concern. So in certain situations, we also felt that there was a delay in obtaining permissions for data reuse, or the necessary permissions could not be obtained. So in all these variety of reasons, we solicited editorial opinions. As we handled more of these complex cases, we modified our workflow accordingly and worked with our editors-in-chief, handling editors, journal staff for discussing appropriate next steps. While the production of the concerned manuscript was put on hold, the ethics teams continued to stay in touch with the authors and updated the EICs and journal staff with relevant information until a resolution is achieved. In some cases, this resolution was not pleasant, and the acceptance of manuscripts had to be revoked. This measure in itself was a big undertaking because it required making adjustments to the standard workflow and processes that we had in place, and keeping everyone informed as we navigated these uncharted waters. The bar graph presented here represents how we resolved these 12 unique and complicated cases with serious concerns of image duplications. After editorial consults, acceptance had to be revoked in 50% of these cases, so for 6 manuscripts. For 3 manuscripts, the authors provided revised figures from replicate experiments, which were reviewed by the handling editors and the editor-in-chief. In one instance, we requested the authors to revise the manuscript and resubmit it because the changes were significant and needed to be reviewed. And in certain cases, in one case, we had to request the authors to repeat the entire internally controlled experiment. So as I'm approaching the end of my presentation in this segment, I'll talk about the lessons we learned that we wanted to share with the authors so that we can educate them to publish sound science and fill the gaps in their knowledge with relevant information. Some of it may not necessarily be surprising, and it's applicable not just to early career researchers, but also to experienced authors running large labs. For example, retaining original data for as long as possible. This is not the data that you've modified for incorporating in the figures, but it's actually the raw, unmodified original data that was first generated. Educating authors on labeling and storing files appropriately under correct folders with all relevant information like data, time, experimental groups, replicate numbers, things of the nature. And of course, an ounce of prevention is better than a pound of cure. So guiding the authors to pay utmost attention while they're assembling their figures to avoid copy-paste errors which are unnecessary and can happen during different stages of submission and handling different versions of the manuscript. Obtaining necessary permissions ahead of time is crucial. And of course, be extremely certain of the data and its accuracy when you're presenting it. The data has to be accurate and representative and reproducible. As publishers too, we need appropriate checks and balances in place. ImageTwin pilot program was successful for us in that it identified over 130 cases of image duplication during the 6 months of the pilot program, which is approximately 4% of the accepted manuscripts. As ASM was able to address these concerns pre-publication rather than having to correct the scientific record later, this was impressive. That said, for 9% of the cases, we solicited editorial consultations. We had to revoke acceptance in 50% of them, which meant about 5% of the accepted manuscripts, which was not a pleasant outcome, but a necessary one. So finally, where do we go from here? We are in the process of modifying our workflow so that we perform the ImageTwin screening at revision stage and not post-acceptance. So this gives the authors some more time to address these concerns and address them sooner. This is also the stage where ASM routinely screens its manuscripts for similarities in text and plagiarism. We are expanding our guidelines to include specific language to our authors on avoiding and addressing image duplication concerns. We'll continue to develop our guidelines to the editors and reviewers so that they are better aware of the processes and screening mechanisms that we have in place. We are working towards streamlining how we conduct the editorial consults, adding specific guidelines in terms of timelines. How do we deal with replicate data? When do we request new experiments from authors or repeating their experiments, and questions of that nature. That said, with all the considerations and with each new case that we see, we intend to continue our journey to learn and grow and continue publishing sound science. And with that, I thank you for your time and attention today. I will wait to answer questions during the Q&A after the next talk. But if you have additional questions or feedback, I share my contact information here and the contact for ASM Journal's ethics team. And we would love to hear from you. So thank you once again.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Aashi. Before we move to our next presentation, I'm not sure if Dr. Jack is in the Zoom room, green room, but if I could just sort of interject for a moment. So I'm part of the GW program here in publishing, and I teach copyright law and contracts and the application of copyright law in publishing. And one of the things I teach my students is how to do a permission request for third-party material. And so as someone who's also in the publishing realm, in medical publishing, I'm used to receiving a lot of requests coming from authors. Do you find that because the onus at your organization is for authors to request third-party material clearances, that you have to do a lot of educating them on how to conduct that permission request and what information they need to include? And how does that process work for you in terms of ensuring that they understand what's being asked of them?
We do have that information included in our instructions to the author guidelines that we have within asm.org. However, if something is missing, it's usually handled during the production process as well, where the production team requests the authors to provide the necessary permission, and they tell them the exact nature of those permissions that they need to obtain and what everything's needed. But yeah, like I said, we require, especially in terms of previous publications, we require our authors to disclose that in the submission form itself. So we have checks and balance in place at the submission stage and also during the production stage.
That's wonderful. I appreciate that. It takes a village, I think, to make sure that permissions are cleared effectively, regardless of what stream of publishing that you're in. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I'd like to introduce our next speaker in this panel, Dr. Leonard Jack, who's joining us from CDC. I see he's got his slides up, so I'll let you take it away from here.
Hello, I've been looking forward to this presentation for the last few days. I am Leonard Jack Jr. I have the pleasure of serving as editor-in-chief of CDC's journal, Preventing Chronic Disease. I've been in this role for about 7 years. I'm also a distinguished research consultant with the CDC. Being in this role requires me to be very open to feedback, to be very courageous, to facilitate sometimes very difficult conversations, and also to surround myself by individuals who may not think exactly the way that I do in order to move the journal to its next best place. And one of the things that I've been very, very committed to over the last 7 years has been to integrate diversity, equity, and inclusion lens to the work that we're doing as relates to the editorial process, the research content, the volunteers that we have to support the journal, how we monitor our progress, and our ability to be upfront and transparent with our readership. So this slide is just sharing with you some stats, some facts about the journal. These are typical facts and stats that most journals will look at. We have a 21% acceptance rate. All the papers that are submitted to the journal are screened by me to decide whether or not they move forward. We have 5 to 8 special collections that are published every year. We also look at these stats from a different perspective, right? So when we look at 21% acceptance rate, we're trying to find out also who's a part of that percentage. And when we look at the number of collections that we publish, we step back and we're trying to think about who has an opportunity to serve as a guest editor of those collections. So we look at this data, of course, like many other journals will look at them, but we're also looking at them for other very important reasons. May you advance, please, for me to the next slide. So our mission and vision has evolved over the years. So this current version of the mission vision for the journal was updated in 2018. The journal decided that it was important not to continue to publish content that didn't embrace some of the complexities or factors that help to shape the health of U.S. citizens and individuals around the world. That we needed to, in addition to that, expand the audience that was taking advantage of the content that we were publishing. And we also needed to do a better job of bringing on individuals who had different perspectives in how they looked at research. Quantitative individuals, those that have more qualitative perspective in their understanding of what shapes health, or those who have a mixed method approach. So our mission, vision, and our audience has evolved over time. Next slide, please. The journal has an incredible team of individuals working behind the scenes to make sure everything, comes across without any hiccups. I want to pay particular attention to our editorial board, associate editors, statistics review committee members, and we just added a student scientific review committee that I'll talk to you about in a little bit. So this looks very different today than when I first came on board in 2016. Staff has shaped up very differently. The departments that you see here look very different. And across all the work that's occurring within the journal, we take a very, very strong diversity, equity, and inclusion perspective. Next slide, please. So in my role as the editor-in-chief, again, a role that I take very, very, very seriously, I am charged to make sure that the content that we publish, of course, is very rigorous. And then I'm also responsible in making sure that when papers are submitted to the journal, each of those papers have an equal opportunity of making it across the finish line. And it is my job to do my very best to position every author for success in that regard. I'm also responsible for creating content that is trustworthy and that also aligns with the mission of the agency and with CDC. And so ethics is at the core of that. It requires me to critique myself. It requires me to make sure that the content that we're publishing does not do anything to contribute to historical harms. Research has had a part in that, but my job is to make sure that the content that we publish as a journal does not extend or build upon historical harm that has occurred in research in the past. So I have a very, very strong responsibility in leading the journal. Next slide. When I first came on board, it was important for me to, of course, touch bases, ask questions of those individuals that were on that earlier organizational chart. Many of the individuals that were in place when the journal first started years back are still with us now, added on additional staff. But it was important for me to just not go just on their perspective on what has gone well, what has not gone well, what should we do differently, what things can we build upon. So one of the things I decided to do was to have an external panel to come in and critique us. And so I reached out to individuals who have been in scientific publishing for a long time and asked them if they would come to CDC, spend a day and a half with us. I would give them access to all the information they possibly would need. No questions were off limits. And we had them to critique us. So next slide. A few of the questions that I asked them to take into consideration to assess where we were, for example, was the mission statement. that we put forth a good one, right? Was the scope of the work that we were doing relevant and beneficial? Were we publishing high quality science? Next slide, please. And then also wanted to know if there was anything that the journal should make a high priority of. So you can imagine they took at it and they gave us very extensive feedback. Next slide, please. So when they generated their report to us, I was, first of all, very, honored that these individuals would come and spend a day and a half with us in person. Prior to them coming to CDC, they had access to a number of documents. They had access to information about who was publishing by gender, by race, categories. They looked at a lot of things for us. So we were able to release to the public the results of that first ever external review. And it helped us to identify areas that we needed to build upon. One of the things that they recommended to us is that we had a lot of content in our journal that looked at the factors that influence health, like, for example, one's age, one's sex, one's race. And then he also encouraged us to step beyond that, right? To look at other factors that are not traditionally reported in research to really give the full landscape of what influences health. They also encouraged us to diversify our editorial board and our associate editorial board. And they also asked us to document that progress and share that progress with the public. So I've established many years back what I call the editor-in-chief column. This is an example of that, where we report out to our audience, our readers, by way of holding ourselves accountable, how we're hitting those benchmarks, those commitments that we make. Next slide, please. So of course, we move forward, right? And there's rich conversation now around diversity, equity, and inclusion. So using the help of our editorial board and our associate editorial board and CDC leadership, we spent a few months trying to think about that. One thing was very clear, that we have been doing this for a while, right? And we may have called it various different other names, but we've been at this for a very long time. We've called it fairness. We've talked about it being transparency, global commitment to building capacity, accountability. We've given it a lot of names, but PCD, for years before DEI came on the scene, has been very committed to that. So I want to go into a little depth around the components, the multi-component aspects of our DEI lens to our work. Next slide. So to facilitate that, we had to sort of figure out for ourselves what diversity, equity, and inclusion means for us. So we want to have a diverse set of individuals at the table, regardless of the demographics. We're looking at research lens, research capacity, geographic location, career status, sexual orientation. We wanted to have a variety of individuals at the table. And we also wanted to make sure that everyone that's been a part of this process has an equal opportunity to provide their input, to provide recommendations. And we also wanted to do something with that. And we wanted to make sure, to the best of our ability, we were inclusive in how we made decisions, how we made changes as a journal. So this occurred at multiple levels. First, with the staff of the journal, next with our authorship, next with peer reviewers, next with our volunteer pool, the editorial board, associate editorial board, statistics review committee, and then also the kind of content, right? The diversity in the content that we were publishing as a journal. Next slide, please. So when I'm talking to individuals about my role, I have a very important role in that, because I'm the one that is connecting the dots. I'm the one that's challenging everybody to look at, for example, our public health research platform, how we've done it in the past. Are we addressing the needs of various different audiences, understanding how the system itself in scholarly publishing can create barriers to making sure there's an equitable approach to having individuals at the table serving as a volunteer or even as an author. So the list goes on. And my job also is to help individuals not be afraid of mistakes, and that we can learn from those mistakes. And I'm the one in the room that's always advocating that we don't need to fix and change everything right away. We need to be very patient. Next slide. So I want to talk quickly about the many ways that we, sort of evolved and used the DEI lens. In terms of research focus, the journal had to acknowledge by way of the external review committee that we were publishing a large amount of our content that only looked at trying to just document the factors, the causes that shape health. And we know that it goes beyond that. Next slide. So we've relied on looking at how public health has evolved over time. There's been tremendous success in public health. Motor safety is an example, healthier babies, mothers, fluoridation of water, improved life expectancy. Next slide, please. And still, when we looked in the past with papers that were published in PCD, most of them were reporting papers, findings around data from large data sets. And these are going to be examples of that. Next slide. So the behavior risk factor surveillance system, the chronic kidney disease surveillance system. Next slide. Right, in the National Health Interview Survey. I'm sharing this with you to say that there was some growth for the journal. We needed to move beyond just publishing papers that would talk about the number of individuals who were living with a chronic condition. It didn't really give us a roadmap on what we could do to intervene on those things. And we were risk factor du jour, if you will, publishing papers that were just limited and not really advancing the science and practice of public health. Next slide. So those papers tend to look at the causes, those individual key risk factors for chronic diseases, tobacco use, lack of physical activity, excessive alcohol use, and papers just really crunched the numbers and told us how bad we were doing on the individual level, how individuals were not taking care of themselves. Next slide. But we know that there are influences other than these typical risk factors, your age, your sex, those risk factors that I talked about previously, whether you're exercising, your nutrition, because 6 out of 10 individuals in the US are living with a chronic condition, and 4 in 10 individuals live with 2 or more chronic conditions, and the chronic conditions are listed at the bottom. So we know we needed to do something very different. And the journal had to expand, and next slide, please, outside of its comfort zone to explore other factors that are at play. We know that these chronic conditions impact individuals across the life stage. Next slide. And we also know that in addition to those chronic conditions that I mentioned on the previous page, NIH, for example, is saying that there are other conditions that we need to bring to focus and that the journal was not addressing. The opioid addiction, infectious disease, COVID-19 is among those. Next slide, please. Mental health, of course, is one of those. Next slide, please. So we had to move beyond the typical characteristics, attributes that we study in research to look at, for example, gender and sex, comorbidities, right? Culture, community settings. And this is important because this required us to diversify the individuals who will be brought to the table that would help us have the expertise to expand and explore in these around these factors. Next slide. Then we add to the mix that not only are we trying to have a better understanding of those factors that influence health, but we also try to understand the settings and how the settings influence health. And this slide is just simply saying that health is influenced at multiple levels beyond just what occurs at the individual level. Next slide. Then we add to the mix, right? Recent conversations about the role of racism in shaping health. The journal has had to also have rich conversations with its volunteer boards about how does the journal now acknowledge the fact that racism in the past was not a part of much of what this journal and other journals were publishing, and also establish that it's important to develop a research framework to do that. Next slide. And so we spent some time trying to actually do that. The column on the left-hand side gives you examples of the type of content that we're now embracing as a journal, moving beyond, again, those individual risk factors to talk about other factors that we haven't previously touched on or uncomfortable talking about, to have research published in this journal and other journals that will help us to understand the role that racism plays in shaping health. Next slide. So with all of that insight, the feedback from our external review panel, and the information that I just shared with you, we had to begin making some changes in terms of our scientific leadership. Next slide, please. So we first started with the editorial board. PCD's editorial board, when I first came on, had about 5, 7 maybe editorial board members. And again, their perspective was very narrow, right? Because that we talked about research in terms of how we need to diversify the platform and how we look at factors that influence health. And that's been an issue in public health for a while, that it has been narrowly focused on the individual level and not some of these other characteristics, attributes, and settings that I talked about. So we had to expand the editorial board, and now our editorial board consists of about 50, 60 talented individuals who represent all different racial ethnic groups, research interests, disciplines, a very dynamic group of individuals who are unafraid to share their views and perspectives. Next slide. We also diversified, increased the number of individuals that are associate editors, and the journal had about 7 individuals that were associate editors. So the difference between the editorial board and the associate editors are the individuals who will be assigned a paper, and they will screen the paper, make decisions on whether or not that paper goes out for peer review. So this is important, right? At this particular level, who decides which paper moves forward is very important. So by expanding the bench, if you will, of individuals who bring different perspectives, different training to the table, research interests, and expertise, we have now been able to expand the type of content that we have as a journal. And we also have been able to increase our tolerance for disciplines and perspectives outside of those that we've actually been trained in. Next slide. In addition, the journal decided that it was important to add another group to the table, those individuals who look at data. We needed to do that because we needed to now begin asking authors, when they submit a paper to us, we needed to know more about how, for example, a study population was identified, because that's very important. Was that study population identified through individuals who self-identified themselves, or was it through individuals that were a part of, or whether the investigator observed and noted the person's race and ethnicity, or was it identified through a database? All these things are very, very important, and we needed to bring together a group of individuals that will be able to help us to develop guidance that will be given to authors so that we will force them in a way to begin to share with us information about their study population, which is very important. Next slide. So what I'm trying to convey here is a diversity issue, is that we needed all disciplines. So we have individuals who bring expertise in psychology, public administration, anthropology, health economics, statistics, biostatistics, and those of us who are working in public health, right? There are many sub-disciplines to public health. I've named them all, don't need to read through all of them. But I've been trying to educate and to just help everyone to understand that we need everyone, all the different disciplines at the table to help us to better understand what influences health, and also to make sure that we're not publishing research in just one narrow area and thinking that that will help us to understand the complexities of what's shaping health and what we need to do about it. Next slide, please. So the peer review process. Next slide. One of the things that I decided to do when I came on board is to not hold back on what makes for a good paper. So we have several different article types. Next slide. And these two slides are just sharing with you those article types. And so what we have done as a journal, we want to position everyone to be successful, right? Regardless of race, ethnicity, regardless if you went to Harvard or if you come from a community college, you're at an HBCU, you're mid-career, you're a senior person in your career. We want to make sure everyone gets information on how to generate a good paper. And we also are utilizing individuals that are serving as associate editors on an annual basis to help us update the guidance that's being provided to authors on how to generate good papers. So for each of these article types, we have identified a checklist that we provide to authors on how to generate an effective and a solid paper. We also provide training to our peer reviewers on how to effectively review papers to make sure that we hope that people looking at a similar set of criteria when they're reviewing papers to increase the fairness in papers that get moved forward. Next slide, please. And we have identified numerous resources that we have provided to authors, again, to level the playing field, right? So we provide, I mentioned to you, the checklist, and we've also instituted, which has really helped for institutions where teaching is a high priority and research is not. Authors can submit an inquiry to the journal to find out whether or not it is a good fit for the journal. We've identified what we call the 10 manuscript problems. We're sharing that with the public so that everyone will know how to generate an effective table. And again, I mentioned the checklist. Next slide, please. So here's an example of the checklist. So we want to make sure that authors understand what needs to be included in a paper to make sure that it is a good paper. So we do that for two reasons. One, to make sure that authors are well positioned to have their paper move through the peer review process effectively. We tell them what we feel would make for a good paper by each of those article types. But we're also trying to do something else. We're also trying to get authors to tell us how well they know and what they know about the populations that they're working with. For example, that fourth bullet here that says provide details on the partners and interested parties who were engaged in developing the program and the objectives that are being reported on. We want to understand if there were efforts to engage individuals who around which the program or the intervention is targeting in helping to shape and to inform it. Next slide, please. So we're constantly looking at the peer review process. We're looking, for example, now to see whether or not papers that are generated by females move through the progression, through the peer review process. And when I see that, I will identify that and bring it up on our monthly calls that we have with the associate editors to bring that into awareness and ask them to really just sort of do a self-reflection to see if there is any implicit bias in what is happening. I mentioned to you before that it's important that those guidelines, those checklists that we've developed is updated, and it's updated not by the same individuals every year. We rotate that around every year, making sure different lenses, different perspectives are being brought to the table. There's training that occurs during our monthly calls around how to effectively review papers. And when we see case examples, we use those during the calls to make sure that we learn from them. Next slide, please. So the training and education is really important. Next slide. So we have invested a significant amount of resources toward this goal. And our commitment around DEI is important because we need to build the trust not only with the audience that is going to read our content, but we need to build the trust with the individuals who are helping to identify the best work that ultimately gets published. During our meetings with the editorial board, during our meetings with the associate editorial board, Oftentimes, individuals are part of those discussions that may not have been a part of those discussions, been at the table, being a part of it for a while. It is my job to be attuned to that, listen for that, find ways to encourage those individuals to be courageous, to speak up and share their feedback. If they're not comfortable doing that in that setting with everyone, I find other ways of getting that feedback. It's really, really important that that takes place. And the other thing, too, is that I know that individuals at the table who are serving in a volunteer capacity are looking to see if there's fairness in what we do on a day-to-day basis as a team, right? Associate editors, editorial board members, before papers are actually published. So I'll give you an example. It is important that when an individual on a call, that's an associate editor, mentions that they have a paper that they want to submit for consideration, they want to talk it out during the call, I will say to them, team, we have a process for that. If you would like to find out if a paper is of interest to the journal, I'm asking all of our volunteers to do the same thing. Individuals that are at institutions that don't have access to the editor-in-chief would do. I need you to submit an inquiry. And then people get back, so, okay, that's right, that's fair. So it's important that we demonstrate that in our day-to-day practice. Next slide, please. So I have the unique opportunity to interact with some of the best thinkers in different areas, in different disciplines around the country. And a while back, we started having monthly calls with them. And I have been trying my best to undo that and say, well, let's go to every other month. And our associate editors, again, they play a very key role, right, in making recommendations for papers. They have absolutely said no. And I think one of the reasons for that is that we continue to talk about important issues that are really health equity driven and science driven at the same time, right? We talk about papers, how they need to raise new research questions based on what I shared with you before that moves us beyond just talking about the typical kinds of influences on health, right? That stat-related conversation that I had with you earlier about the need to describe that study population. We talk about the need to be reflective around inclusive language, and we always talk about ways to just become better at what we do. Next slide. In addition to that, staff also, my staff, the editorial team, our writer editors, also have a very important role, and we do training around that as well. Next slide. So there's ongoing training around inclusive language. AMA has some wonderful things out there. CDC also has generated some guidance on inclusive communication. We are constantly trying to stay current, and we feel as though it's been very effective. On the right-hand side, you see examples of comments, positive feedback that some of our staff have gotten. Next slide. All right, next slide, we can move on. All right, so one of the things that I think is really important as a journal, we identify upfront at the beginning of the year things that we feel we're going to try to execute, and particularly if we want to move any of our goals around diversity, equity, and inclusion forward. We want to talk about all the ways the journal has been a part of that, not just within the journal, but in the profession as well. So I'm very actively involved in CSE, and we have made the commitment that we're not only going to publish content on all the wonderful ways we can improve health, but we're also going to publish content on what is happening behind the scenes to position authors to be in the best position, all authors, to have their work published. And whatever those commitments are, we provide the public with updates in the editor-in-chief column. Next slide. And I believe by doing that, we have been able to move into other rich areas of publication content. At the very top, you see behavioral, psychological, genetic, environmental, social factors. That was an area where we had papers generated where we were talking about all the factors that influence health, but we've moved beyond that now to some of those other areas that you see. I just mentioned one. We're moving to publish papers that talk about the development, implementation, evaluation of population-based interventions. Again, a diversity issue in terms of the content of research that's published in the journal. We've been able to move outside of just looking at risk factors to those other areas. Next slide. And we've been able to publish some really interesting content, right? And one that I'm really excited about that we recently published was a collection of papers that talked about racism as a public health crisis. Next slide. And we use a similar approach that we've used with the editorial board, the associate editorial board. The journal pulled together a guest editorial board for that collection of papers. Those guest editors came from all different disciplines, various institutions, various academic training perspectives to the table. And I think that was one of the reasons why that collection on racism as a public health concern has been very successful. Next slide, please. Winding down almost to the end. And the other thing that I decided to do, and it started this year, is I decided that many of us have been at the table for a long time. Some of us are willing and flexible to change, and then some of us are not. And I thought that it would be really nice to start with those individuals who are coming up the pipeline. So we have initiated this year a student scientific writing and review committee, 15 students from around the country, various different institutions, racial ethnic background, different interests in terms of public health research moving forward. They've been having a really, really great time. And I'm trying to educate them on what is effective scientific writing, how to review papers or serve as an effective reviewer. They're going to shadow some of our associate editors, and they're just being provided journal operations one-on-one because we want to see a diversified group of individuals moving forward and taking our place. Next slide. So that brings me to the fact that if we're able, I hope, to do all the things that I talked about, right, with diversity, equity, inclusion at the center, then as a journal, I'm hoping we will be able to accomplish our mission. And that is, we want to promote dialogue with individuals who are not in the same discipline and perspective, right? We want to promote dialogue among researchers, evaluators, practitioners, a range of individuals, how we can all work together to improve the health of the country, actually around the world, using various different approaches to reduce health disparities that we see in this country. Next slide. And we think that we've been able to do that with these keys of success, right? We've started where we are. We made it comfortable to have uncomfortable conversations at times. We're making it okay to learn from one another, and we're sharing lessons learned. And the next slide, I think, kind of brings it home for us. So each year, I believe, having taken this approach, it's taken us a while, but we are seeing incremental improvements in the journal's impact factor. Last year, in fact, it almost doubled. So the journal is third out of, I think, like 33 US open access journals. It's 22nd out of 252 open access journals worldwide, and our numbers keep improving. And I believe, I might be wrong, that is because we've taken this very different approach to our work, being more inclusive, bringing individuals to the table, that helps us to produce content that's different, advancing the research and science, but then also shaping the future for the next generation of individuals working behind the scenes to do scientific publishing. So we're really proud of that. Next slide. One of my favorite quotes. We all should know that diversity makes for a rich tapestry, and we must understand that all the threads of the tapestry are equal in value, no matter what the color. That concludes my talk, and open for questions, I guess, my co-presenter and I.
Dr. Jack, thank you for such a comprehensive presentation. I just wanted to comment personally. There are two underlying qualities that are embedded in all of your slides, many slides, and in all of your efforts, which are workflows, really structured, specific workflows with clearly defined expectations, and then patience. Those are things that really have to work well together. So I just wanted to acknowledge that you've included those because they're really important parts of the broader initiative to learn and develop ourselves individually and collectively. So thank you for that.
Sure.
Once again, if you would like to ask any questions for our panelists, please use the interact button. John and I will intercept those questions and share them here.
Meanwhile, I do have a question for Dr. Jack. Great presentation, both of you. I love how you're both so detailed and specific. And I'm kind of like you, Dr. Jack. I go through a lot of slides, like a lot, which you did. I love to see a process map too. You had a great process map there. So one question, I used to work at the RAND Corporation, and we did like formal benchmarking with with other research institutes like national academies and MITRE and many others. Do you do any kind of formal benchmarking either on DEIA or on other issues with other like government journals, kind of peer journals in your space?
Mm-hmm. No, can't say we've done that, right? I think that's a great idea, right? To actually do that. And there's so much happening in the DEI space, right? And one of the things that I find myself asking myself with all the new things that are coming out, how will we at some point know if it worked, right? Because at some point, there has to be a richer conversation about all the principles that we've talked about that we're trying to do. How do we assess whether or not they have made a difference? And then how do we share that with one another? And is there a place to kind of collect where that evidence is around what success looks like to determine whether or not we do some things the same, we stop doing some things, we evolve. And I think that needs leadership, actually. I think moving forward. I don't know if anyone is actually doing that. What I've been trying to do with my journal is not just label it, but find ways to track it, to understand it, to be able to confidently say that we believe these changes are helping us to do things differently. So hopefully at some point, maybe next year when we're ready, we can release some of that, and maybe others are doing the same. Yeah, we'll see.
Great, thank you. And we do have a question that came in for Aashi. So your presentation went into a lot of detail about trying to identify image manipulation and repetition of images. What we suppose that AI is starting to give you nightmares, maybe? Are you prepared for that? Do you think there's any hope to identify images that were created by AI in the future as it gets better and better? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, isn't that the question, right? Can we ever be prepared? It's progressing further, and we are currently just trying to catch up. But we are using AI to defeat AI to a certain extent. ImageTwin uses AI algorithms. There are other softwares that detect image integrity issues within images that are submitted. Whether those images are generated by AI or not is still a question. We haven't encountered any such cases just yet. But yeah, who knows what the future brings. So kind of prepared, kind of not.
Yeah, it's going to be difficult, I think. It's only going to get better. Well, we thank both of you for these presentations, Dr. Leonard Jack and Aashi Chaturvedi.